I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Alan Luxembourg, president of the the Foreign Policy Research. We need a new president. The retiring president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. As many of you know, I retire at the end of this year. And after 44 years at FPRI, I can't tell you what a great privilege and a pleasure it has been to serve at FPRI and to make friends of all the people who come to our programs like you today. So I want to thank all of you for your active participation, for your support. I'm also happy to be able to give a call out to our president-designate, Raleigh Flynn. Can you stand up, Raleigh? Say. By coincidence, Raleigh is a 30-year veteran of the CIA, which sort of is the topic for tonight's program. I do want to thank the National Liberty Museum for hosting us. This is, I think, the 6th season of Geopolitics with Granieri, but I think we've been at the museum for a little bit longer than that. And I want to thank the Stanley and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation for sponsoring the series. And I also want to thank Ron Granieri, who's been the inimitable host of Geopolitics with Granieri, a program designed to step back from the heated arguments of the day and try to shed light through history, culture, and geography on these issues. For an institute like FPRI, this is probably the best time to be a nonpartisan institute not inside Washington. So FPRI is enjoying a great time this year, and I thank you all for helping make that possible. In the meantime, I'll turn over the proceedings to Ron Granieri.
Thanks, Alan. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is Tuesday night in Philadelphia. The world is as complicated as ever, so let's talk about it. Welcome to the September 2019 edition of Geopolitics with Granieri, FPRI's monthly discussion of international affairs. As Alan just told you, I am Ron Granieri. I'm the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West, your host and moderator of today's discussion. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you live here this evening, September 17th, 2019, at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia, and those who may be watching on the internet today or another day. It's great to be here with all of you for this first conversation of our fall season. Speaking in 1961 on the retirement of Director of Central Intelligence Allen Dulles, President Kennedy declared, "Your successes are unheralded, your failures are trumpeted." And he had a point. Intelligence professionals labor in the shadows. Their secret successes in thwarting our nation's foes, often overlooked by a public and a political leadership that is otherwise quick to denounce them for attacks they did not stop, or when damaging details of operations come to light. Only rarely is success apparent, and those responsible for that success can only indirectly enjoy public adulation. They're not allowed to take individual credit. For some, their only reward is an anonymous star on the memorial wall in CIA headquarters, not far from the sign reminding us, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Our guest tonight, Neda Bakos, knows all this and more. In her career as a CIA analyst and targeter, she felt the frustrations of chasing al-Qaeda leaders and trying to make sense of the post-9/11 world, and also enjoyed the sense of accomplishment of seeing the public enemy that she helped track down, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, pay the ultimate price for his crimes. Along the way, she experienced the tensions between professionals and politicians who hope to use intelligence to advance particular agendas, walking the tightrope between safeguarding agency standards and respecting the primacy of elected officials. She experienced the high pressures and patient study of intelligence analysis, the combined boredom and terror of fieldwork, and the murky and frustrating world of CIA bureaucratic politics, including its, quote, impenetrable patriarchal structure. She has told her personal and professional story in a new book, The Targeter, which takes her from a small farm town in Montana to the maze-like CIA campus in Langley, Virginia, to the deserts of Iraq and back. Through it all, she emerges as an honest and thorough analyst who provided devoted service to the CIA and the American people with very much to teach us. So how has the CIA performed in the era of the global war on terror? What should American leaders and the American public expect from their intelligence agencies? What do intelligence professionals think about their role in the American political system? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation with our guest, Neda Bakos. A Senior Fellow in the Program on National Security and a 2018 Templeton Fellow of FPRI, Neda Bakos is a highly regarded national security expert with 20 years of knowledge and experience in global intelligence. As a CIA analyst, she was a key member of the team charged with analyzing the relationship between Iraq, al-Qaeda, and the 9/11 attacks, and the chief targeting officer tracking Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. She was featured in the Emmy Award-winning HBO documentary Manhunt, and is a frequent media commentator as well as a consultant to a variety of organizations, C-level corporate executives, senior-level government officials, and frontline technical teams. A dedicated and nationally known intelligence professional and a valued member of the FPRI scholarly family, we are delighted to have her with us tonight. Welcome, Neda Bakos. So Neda, what led you to join the CIA?
I really was focused on working overseas. And at the time, there weren't a lot of jobs overseas. Private sector wasn't hiring and paying for people to move overseas. And I saw an ad in The Economist, and it was a general ad for the CIA, and it had a website. So I went ahead and trolled through the jobs and applied online.
And the rest is history.
Yes.
You got your anonymous envelope.
Right, and this was the late 90s, yeah.
What kind of advice would you give, to jump ahead a little bit, what advice at all would you give to a young person who was thinking about joining the CIA today? Would you want them to do it the way you did it?
Probably not. I think in many respects I got lucky. The agency at the time wasn't hiring broadly. This was under the Clinton administration, and there still was a bit of a moratorium on hiring for federal jobs. And the job that I applied for, I just happened to have this niche skill set. And I think now what I would really encourage and what I tell people when they ask me about joining the agency is just focus on the things that you love, whether it's bioengineering, data scientist, politics. Focus on the things that you love, the subject matter that you love, and pursue a degree and an education and experience in that area.
Mm-hmm. What popular presentations of intelligence work? Well, we're all fans of various presentations. Are there any? Do you have a favorite, or one that you think most approximates what you actually did?
For TV and film.
For TV and film.
Well, I think there's bits and pieces of a variety of shows that ring true. I think large part because so many former agency CIA people end up being consultants. I was a consultant for a couple of shows. I really did like The Americans, not because I think it resembles the CIA, because it's obviously about KGB officers, but just the pace and how long it takes them to gather intelligence and work each subject matter or target. I thought that one was interesting, and it's written by a former CIA analyst.
Based on your experiences, well, actually, no, a bigger question is, how did you end up becoming a targeter? And what is the difference between being a targeter and an analyst?
So an analyst is the one that will digest all of the raw intelligence that comes in from various forms and presents that to the policymaker, whether it's in a briefing or a presidential daily brief or any kind of written memo or product. They're the face to the policymaker from the CIA in many respects for their bottom line assessment. On the operations side, which Raleigh can speak to, they are the ones that go out and recruit assets to spy for the United States.
Did you feel, you worked in the field interrogating, participating in interviews with detainees, and you also wrote presidential daily briefs. Which is harder?
Well, on the interrogation piece, I was in Iraq when I was doing the interrogation, so it was people that were in U.S. military custody. Typically, people think of the CIA's black sites and torture program. That wasn't the program that I was participating in because I was in Iraq. I think there's a lot of challenges that come with being an analyst. You know, you have to coordinate your work with all the other analysts who are looking at the subject matter. So I was writing PDBs that would have like 7,000 people on the email distro just for them to be able to weigh in and pull apart my analysis and basically humiliate you in front of everybody you work with. And you have to develop a tough skin to be able to do that. And I think one of the reasons I wrote this book is because I don't think there's a lot of analysts who write about their work that worked at the agency.
And when you talk about your work, or what do other analysts think about how you've described what analysts do? Are they glad somebody finally told the story, or does everybody want to tell you how they would have done it differently, like the presidential daily
Almost
brief?
everybody who, as a friend of mine, as an analyst, has appreciated the fact that there is an analyst out there writing about their perspective.
This is good. One of the tensions that you point out in the book is the tension between being asked backward-looking questions, so members of the administration asking to discover connections between Iraq and al-Qaeda, but backward-looking ones versus forward-looking questions that are actually dealing with strategy going forward. How should intelligence organizations balance the need to sort of fill in the gaps of our historical understanding versus developing actionable intelligence for the future?
I mean, for a president or somebody at cabinet level to be able to make a decision, they need context, and quite often that's historical context. But as a targeting officer, which I transitioned to on the ops side, that's really for actionable intelligence, and so it's a completely different type of focus. But for the policymaker, you really have to, you're there to serve them. If they're asking a question, you have to answer it. And in that case, in the lead up to the war, providing context was important. The part that was a bit frustrating was after the war and after the invasion, we were still trying to answer all the questions on whether or not Iraq had anything to do with 9/11 and al-Qaeda. And our assessment prior to the war was that it did not, but that those questions continued throughout the invasion.
And when the question gets asked again and again, and you're pretty sure both that you've answered it and that there hasn't been any new reason to change your answer, what is the appropriate way for an intelligence professional to respond to that kind of question?
Well, the appropriate way is to respond to the question in whatever form you think will resonate at that time. I did that for the most part and definitely ended up frustrated.
Was there ever any desire within the agency, either within the circles directly around where you were working or higher up, to figure out how do you encourage, or let's say, how do you discourage those kinds of questions once the agency feels like they've answered? Or is that simply not the agency's place to tell the politicians to move on and ask something else?
It depends on the relationship with the director from the CIA with the administration. And that has a lot to do with it, but it's really not the agency's place to tell the policymaker what they can and cannot ask, because the CIA cannot make policy.
Right. And as a professional, right, so how do you, with other professionals, how do you deal with when you see disagreements or you feel as though policy needs to go in a different direction? What levers exist at all to encourage the discussion?
Part of it is the products that we provide and the briefings that are provided, in addition to any of the briefings that happen on Capitol Hill. So you have to have a policymaker who's amenable to hearing the information in order for you to drive that kind of discussion so that you can give them all of the information and make sure that they're basing their decision on all the facts.
What do you, related to that is when you do your job, you wait to see what happens. What kind of internal discussions go on in the agency to, so when you see the result of the responses that you're being given, do you then coordinate actions or responses for the future? Are there internal briefings within the agency to say, they're going to ask this again and we need to say this? Or is each analyst essentially left to their own devices to give the appropriate response?
We go through lots of training to brief policymakers. In addition to, there's a lot of processes built into how they conduct business. So all of these briefings are coordinated and vetted internally within the agency so that those conversations by nature are happening before the policymaker, asks the question again. Now, Whether or not the agency has any bandwidth to continue to answer those questions over and over and over, that becomes the crux of the story.
The crux of the story. I mean, I will say that one of the challenges of being an interviewer is to figure out how do you keep asking the same questions over and over to see if you get a different answer. But that's very good. Well, then let's think about this.
I'll get out a chart.
That's right. We'll get a chart. You just point. You can say you can number.
Yeah.
Right. This is answer number 3. Based on your experience about the discussion about the Iraq War and its legacies, what do you think the general public should know about Iraq, Al Qaeda, and ISIS? Broadly speaking, as topics that you think they know imperfectly or could know better?
That's a broad topic.
That's why I wanted to give you a big space.
This one's a hard one for me because even while I was writing my book, I would say things to my husband like, well, everybody knows X, right? And he'd look at me just dumbfounded and say, nobody knows that. Of course they don't know that. Nobody lives in this minutia in this world that you existed in.
Right.
So that's a hard question for me to answer.
Okay.
But obviously, the premise of the book is instilling that 9/11 and Al Qaeda were not tied to Iraq. They were not tied to Saddam's regime. And I think, in large part, the public understands that now, right after the invasion, because I think of the language that some members of the administration were using, that was still confusing.
When you tell the story, in addition to telling the story about how you ended up becoming the targeter for Zarqawi, you also tell the story about how Zarqawi became Zarqawi, right? How he goes from being a petty criminal to being the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and essentially, so one of the godfathers, I guess you could say, of ISIS. How does our understanding of following his career, what does this tell us about how terrorist organizations or terrorist leaders develop, right? Have we learned lessons that we could use to identify rising leaders earlier because we know the story of Zarqawi?
Extremists obviously are attracted to extremist messages for all sorts of reasons. A lot of them Zarqawi started out as a street thug, a criminal, and was radicalized while he was in prison when he was with a cleric who convinced him that this message was the true message, was radical Islam. And you see this whether it's white supremacy or any kind of radicalization and extremism. People are attracted to it for a variety of reasons. But I think there's a lot we can learn from really the overarching themes and the ideology that they're attracted to. And so there's a lot we can do with that and have done, I think. And I would like to see the government focused on a much broader, bigger program at this point domestically.
And why do you think that it is not? If you'd like to see the government do something, why do you think they're not doing it?
Well, that's a hot.
I know. I waited 10 whole minutes before I got to that.
I think it's willingness. It's willingness, interest. Possibly, there's not anybody within the inner circle that is really having this conversation and has the knowledge and background.
So
how's that for a political answer?
That's an excellent answer to get going there. Because I'm always interested in questions about interviews. So your experience as an interviewer and being interviewed, do you?
By who? Polygrapher or
polygrapher? Considering you've been interviewed a bunch of times talking about this book, and you also conducted interviews with lots of people in Iraq. Detainees, right? Including Evil Hagrid, which I thought was a great name for a detainee. But what works to get the best answers from a detainee?
I think this depends on the interviewer, right? Okay. And the detainee. In my case, I was coming at it from, a 30-year-old white woman from the U.S. government. I had to use different tools than probably some of the U.S. military members or even some the coalition partners had to use. For me, what worked was just having fundamental conversations, asking them background questions, just establishing a rapport, talking about their kids, their wife, stuff that I think in some cases men just don't think about. You know, what was your daily life like? How old are your kids? What's their favorite thing to do? Things like that.
Right. Did you find that your colleagues relied on you to ask those types of questions, or did they ever sort of watch what was working for you and decide maybe we should try that too?
Not necessarily. Things were moving so quickly. Everybody was just really focused on their own.
Which was harder, right? To be a 30-year-old woman as an interviewer in Iraq, or being a 30-year-old woman who had to work within the CIA bureaucracy?
You know, well.
So you thought the question about terrorism was hard.
You know, the bureaucracy within the CIA isn't so bad. I mean, it certainly exists. It's in some ways a well-oiled machine in compared to some other government organizations. And I do make a statement about the patriarchy that exists. On the analyst side, fundamentally it came down to how well you write, how well you brief, and if you can do the analysis, is whether or not you can do your job. On the operations side, I found it to be a little bit different. There was definitely an element of patriarchy that was much more obvious and dictated career paths.
Do you miss the intelligence world?
I do.
Yeah?
I
What do you
miss my
about it?
colleagues.
Yeah?
I miss the work, the sense of mission. I don't miss the hours.
Right.
Yeah.
So am I correct? So when you were doing morning briefs, you had to be at the office by 3 o'clock in the morning. Is that true?
Yeah, so we were briefing, my colleague and I were briefing the briefers. So these are the briefers that will go out and brief the president, the vice president, cabinet officials. I was there as a member of the Iraq team in the Counterterrorism Center and preparing the briefers for questions that their policymaker would have. So have to quickly digest a bunch of the intelligence that would come in overnight from Iraq because they're awake and sending fast and furious notes to us to tell people. So we were doing that.
A basic practical question I wondered about is you talk about dealing with cables from overseas. These days, how much of the work is done on paper and how much of it is done in electronic form?
I mean, at the time, most of it was electronic. Now, I have no idea.
Yeah. That's fair. I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm going to turn to the audience. So I want to say this to the audience is when it's time to answer questions, first of all, the first question always goes to someone who has never been to Geopolitics with Granieri before. So if this is your first time here, right, be ready. There will be a couple of folks with microphones to come to you. So while you think about what your next question is going to be, I'm going to ask about the creation of your book, right? How would you characterize your experience in getting your book from the initial ideas you got down on paper to getting into this attractive cover on our hands?
That word is probably not one I'll say here. My book was stuck for 2 years in the government review process, which at the time was unprecedented, but lately it seems like those wheels have slowed down again. I ended up having a manuscript sent back after I'd submitted it after a year, and most of it was blacked out and redacted. Not all of it. So I asked and asked and asked very nicely for the government to sit down and let's discuss some of these redactions, because I knew some of it had to be frivolous, because there was entire pages black, which that's just not accurate, because "the" is not classified. So in order to get them to do that, I ended up having to file a lawsuit against the government and to get them to come to the table and have this discussion. And in large part, it was because the CIA did not have leverage to get the manuscript back and discuss changes by other government agencies. Because I'd worked so much with special operations forces, they had privilege to edit and redact my manuscript as well.
And so you felt that the CIA couldn't or wouldn't push those agencies to lighten up?
There is nothing in their agreement that gives them an end date to require it. by, and there's nothing in in their reciprocal agreements that says we get to scrutinize your edits.
Because on the historical level, right, there's an ongoing problem of declassification.
Yes.
Even when you're talking about things that are 30 years old. So did you end up writing a completely different book the second time?
Not necessarily, because after I filed the lawsuit, they all agreed to sit down and talk.
Right.
And so I spent a day at the Pentagon, a day at the CIA, and came out largely intact, not entirely, but
Do you have a sense that the process has improved as a result of what happened to you?
no.
No. I imagine you know of one or two people who might be working on similar books and having similar problems?
I get lots of emails, yes, asking for advice. I should start charging.
It's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, all right. Well, I now turn to the audience. Do we have any questions from the audience, from anybody who has never been to Geopolitics with Granieri before? The first hand up, all the way in the back of the room, right there, the person in the back of the room, yes. Wait till the microphone comes to you and speak directly into the microphone, please.
We have heard quite a lot about how there was no planning for pacifying Iraq after the expected easy victory. And that's clearly the way things were. But let us imagine that there had been planning and that there had been effective pacification, and that at least it wouldn't have been the case that there was another several years of bloodbath and total rupturing. I'm trying to ask myself, how would our view of Iraq differ had the administration handled its planning in the way that it really should have? I'm not saying that I'm therefore in favor of their having gone into Iraq, but what might have been the outcome, and how would we view it? And what difference might it have made in the Middle East?
Would different planning have made a difference, or was there actually planning that was simply ignored?
I didn't see any planning. I didn't see evidence of planning. None of my counterparts that were in DOD at general level tell me they didn't see planning. So the difference, I mean, that's, of course, hard to predict, but at the very least, maybe we wouldn't have had a power vacuum for Zarqawi to build al-Qaeda in Iraq. Maybe we wouldn't have ISIS on the scale that we have today. I mean, it's hard to tell. ISIS, Iraqis wouldn't have had to lose their lives in tens of thousands of numbers because of the conflict.
Let's go, Bunzi, right here. Bring my microphone? Yeah. No, they're first. Joe first. I'm sorry. Then you.
Ladies
I'm
first,
sorry.
then
Ladies
okay.
first. Sorry.
Could you compare for us the differences in value between human intelligence gathering versus signals intelligence?
Oh, there's that.
I mean, they're both valuable, and they both vary in veracity. Just because something comes in from a technical collection doesn't mean it's always 100% accurate. Those can also be used to fool the enemy. Both of them are valuable. Both of them are flawed, obviously, and require analysis and context around them.
Fair? It's right here.
Neda, I'd like to ask you about mission and the mix between intelligence gathering and analysis on one hand and active measures on the other, and whether the mix as it stands today is appropriate to the agency as it's constituted and appropriate also to its legislatively defined mission. So, and then I wanted to ask you also about open sources, and are there particular publications that you particularly relied upon a lot and found yourself going back to a lot?
You take them in any order you like.
So for your first question, can you explain to me what you mean by active measures? What you're thinking, sort of context-wise?
Well, in terms of, what I mean by active measures is, I suppose, people going or missions that are designed to either thwart actions abroad, actions by foreign powers. It could be on a human level, or it could be technological. So that's, I suppose, generically, that's what I mean by active measures.
I mean, I don't have visibility necessarily into CIA's current stature. I don't work there, and I haven't been there since 2010. At the time, there is, it was chaotic, but there was at least a kind of an equilibrium coming back to collection after 9/11. And I think that's a lot of the consternation was around, are we really focusing on the right things, because we were so focused on terrorism. And I think that was the right question to ask, because the pendulum had swung so far the other direction that they needed to achieve, some kind of equilibrium and look at some of the other national security issues out there, like Russia, for instance, which really didn't get so cold after all.
For instance, in general, do you find that your experience, of course, is unique, but do you feel like the agency is good at doing multiple things at once, or does the political focus of the administration have a great deal of effect on what the agency's working on?
I mean, it's built to do multiple things at once. Of course, policy does drive a little bit of the prioritization, but that's really ahead of time. There's something called the NID that's built specifically for the intelligence community to prioritize what they will collect and analyze, the broader, bigger topics.
And when you're putting together a presidential daily brief, is there pressure to only talk about things that you know that are on the president's mind, or what kind of, do you ever, or are the briefers encouraged to include things they feel like have not reached the president's radar yet?
Well, it's really just driven by topic and the analysis. I had a weird, I guess, experience because I had written so many presidential daily briefs. It felt like I was having a dialogue with the president. That's not very common in an analyst career. So I would get feedback from his briefer asking, a question on the previous PDB, and so I would include that in the next iteration and provide some more context, or just answer the question in general. But yeah.
Interesting. All right, question. Let's go right up here in the front. The microphone's coming to you, sir.
Sure.
The microphone right here first, Bob, and then you're next. I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Sure. Could you just elaborate a little bit on what exactly is meant by targeter and what you do? I mean, Zakari's name's mentioned. He was all over the news. It's sort of obvious that he'd be a target, so I'm not quite clear on what exactly it was you were doing.
Yeah.
So the targeter role at the time, and it's evolved since then, was really just in the operations side, and it was applying the same sort of synthesis that an analyst would do when they're providing products for an intelligence or a policymaker. Instead, you would take that skill set and look for tactical, actionable information. So whether you're giving it to the U.S. military or it was a platform that the CIA had to take action on, the targeting officer, and at the time, I was focused on counterterrorism operations inside of Iraq. So my whole job was focused on dismantling and terrorist networks, mostly Zarqawi's.
Interesting. Good. All the way in the back, Bob Branson.
Curious, in your role as an interviewer, in your role as an analyst, what is your and your compatriots who occupy similar roles knowledge of the Arabic language, knowledge of Arabic culture, and how do you deal with those schisms in bridging the linguistic and cultural gaps, both personally and in the CIA generally?
Yeah.
So when I was sent there as a representative of the team that I was working on, which is the one from the Counterterrorism Center focused on analyzing the Iraq relationship with terrorist organizations. I had to be well-versed in the culture, in all of the historical context, I didn't have to have Arabic language that was native, because the agency is so incredibly picky about languages. Even some native speakers don't pass their linguist tests to become a translator. So they would prefer it be done correctly rather than leave it up to an analyst who has, maybe a 3 level out of 4. So it was more important to have the knowledge and the background, especially at the time, about Saddam's regime. I did have a translator with me at all times that worked for the CIA, so I had that luxury of having a native speaker that understood all the colloquialisms, all the regional issues that would come up for language.
Good. Let's go over to this side of the room. Right here all the way up front, please. This gentleman and then this lady here. The microphone's coming to you, sir. There it is. In your hand. There you go.
In 2003, the debate was, does Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction? And George Tenet said on TV, and I believe the government, it's a slam dunk. Could you give me your comment on that?
You knew somebody was going to ask, right? That's right.
Well, I address this a little bit in my book, too. I was not on the team that was charged with evaluating WMD, so I didn't have a lot of optics into what they were looking at. But what I do know from my experience, and I write about it a little bit, is that some of the same detainees and some of the same information that the WMD side was looking at, we were having to use as sources as well, because they were asking them about terrorism. And on our side, the information wasn't lining up. We were poking holes in a lot of the information from a couple of detainees. When you go back and read the National Intelligence Estimate, it doesn't say that there is an imminent threat from WMD. It says that he's focused, essentially, on building the WMD, that he might have the parts and pieces to pull this together, but not in the immediate future. And I think when I read that, even now, and think about the fact that the urgency was completely not communicated, I don't think, to the American people. I mean, unless you were able to read the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate.
You mean urgency in the sense that the lack of urgency, there was no urgency on the part of the analysts, but there was a great deal of urgency on the part of the people who were communicating to the public. Good, all right. Come back to that now.
Considering the agency is a collector and reviewer of facts, intelligence, how do you handle facts that you think whose accuracy is suspect or biased? How do you handle them in terms of, do you give them to the policymaker, or do you weed them out?
So if you do have to include information in a brief or a product, you use caveats and give them context about, this stated fact, but here's why this is not necessarily, the accuracy can't be verified because X, Y, and Z, so that they at least understand, even though this person may have said this, doesn't make it actually true.
And so you can say that people are saying something.
Of course.
Right, but
yes.
but you can't. And this goes back to the question we batted around a little bit earlier. Like, let's say you present something as murky and unclear, and then when you hear it come out in a press briefing or a speech, it sounds like it's a slam dunk. Mm-hmm. Do you have much experience of discovering how it got from being murky to a slam dunk, or do you just sort of take it for granted that once something goes into the political translator machine, there just ain't no telling what it's going to be?
Well, that's my experience now. But at the time, we actually had a copy of Colin Powell's speech that he was going to present to the UN prior to the invasion. And our piece of it, focusing on terrorism and Zarqawi, all the feedback we had given and all the edits we gave didn't evidently stick with the piece, because by the time he gave the speech at the UN, it looked very different than what we provided.
That's fair. Right up here, up front. Let's say right. This nice lady right here.
Did you ever find yourself treated differently because you are a woman?
At the CIA?
Well, in what you did there, yes.
I mean, that's hard to say, right? I think just it's a reflection of society, the CIA. So the same type of patriarchy that exists in the United States, it also existed inside the halls of the CIA. So there were times when I felt like I was treated differently because I was a woman, and it's not unlike what we experience on a daily basis.
And my other question was, were you ever in a situation where it was dangerous?
Yeah, being in Iraq was,
That's what I thought.
yeah, the whole time, yeah.
So you went with people who were surrounding you?
No.
No.
When I got there, it was in 2003, the summer, it was just a couple months after the invasion. And as a reflection of not having much planning, we were just kind of left to our own devices in some ways. I mean, I think now about some of the stuff that I did, and it was just ridiculous that I was allowed to do it.
Next, let's go over here, sir. Keep your hand up there, and the microphone will come to you. This gentleman's going to bring in the microphone.
I wonder, when you were chasing Zarqawi, did you have personal contact with General Stanley McChrystal?
So I always had a person embedded with his team, so yes. We actually, when I built the targeting team, I had a person that was forward deployed with McChrystal's team in Balad, and then another person in Baghdad, so we had constant communication.
That's good. All right, let's go to the Professor Kurth right there, please.
I have a question about the level of analysis that you can use, not only in your own analyses, but then might be slightly differently in the principles that you're briefing. In particular, I've had a number of experiences with people who served in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and also in Kabul and also in Damascus. And they said something like the following. In the case of Iraq, someone I know was working in the embassy during the first 2 years, 2003, 2005 of the invasion. And he said that it could not become operational in terms of briefing top officials about the distinction between Shiites and Sunnis. That was not negotiable. You could not talk about that particular religious or ethnic division. You'd use words like the government and the insurgents. And similarly, in Syria, during the first 2 years of the rebellion, I remember a briefing from someone from the Defense Intelligence Agency, this is the Pentagon, there were CIA people there, and somebody asked him a question, well, what about the distinctions between Sunnis and Alawites? Doesn't that have something to do with it? And he said, no, we can't get down to that granular level. It's government and opposition. And the most interesting case, perhaps removed from your territory, was someone who worked very high in regard to analyzing military aid to the Pakistanis, and then later he was director of the policy planning staff in the State Department. And he said that in the embassy in both Kabul and also in Pakistan, in the embassy, you couldn't talk about the distinction between Pashtuns and Tajiks and the rest. And the reason was because the Pakistani, their counterparts, didn't want to talk about that. So there was no way to operationalize discussion about the ethnic divisions might having something to do with the support of the Taliban or not. In other words, the Taliban, in some ways, this person thought, was essentially the armed militia of the Pashtuns. And so I'm just wondering, in your own analysis, you did say, of course, and I think that must have been certainly the case, you and others got very into the culture of the countries you were studying, and therefore you would have gotten into these ethno-religious distinctions that were then refracted into politics, including violent politics. But did you find that at a certain point you weren't allowed to really, or not enabled to talk to the top principals at that level, or to talk to the counterparts in the host government.
So were there taboos? Were you told some topics were too hot to handle?
So we were never told that we couldn't discuss and provide information about Sunni Shia rifts and sectarian issues. The one thing that we were initially avoiding, but we still used it, was the administration didn't want to hear the word insurgent, because that meant the Iraqis were not embracing us. And so there couldn't be an insurgency. This must be terrorists. How could the Iraqis not be happy that we're here to spread democracy like glitter?
So, like, and like glitter, it gets everywhere and creates a big mess, and you can't clean it up.
Pretty much.
So did you ever get a product sent back to say, do a global search and replace and take out every use of the word insurgent and replace it with terrorist?
No.
No. Or you just knew better than to use it?
We had a great PDB editorial staff, and no.
So but they knew that there were some words
There's
were
some
triggers.
trigger words, yes.
All right.
That was a trigger word.
This is good to know. Trigger words are important.
But that's what that's what the CIA is there for. If they're not willing to stand up to the policymaker and say, I have to provide you the truth. I know that you don't like it, but this is the truth. Otherwise, what's the point?
Otherwise, what's the point? Very good. All the way in the back, please. Right there, yeah.
Oh, whoa. Excuse me. Has communications between the various agencies gotten any better, or got any better, once they created a director of national intelligence? Because I know that the State Department had something like 15,000-page paper written on how to pacify Iraq, and the Department of Defense, or at least the Defense Logistics Agency, had another paper about how to increase their economies, and neither of them were followed or read. I don't know if they were read, but they weren't followed at all. Has it gotten any better? I know you've been gone for a while.
So my experience, the DNI was formed while I was there, the Director of National Intelligence, who was just the overarching umbrella over all the intelligence organizations. And this was done by Congress. It was a finding after 9/11 to try to improve intelligence sharing, because that's what they have just decided was the crux of the problem. So the DNI was formed largely without any teeth. So especially while I was there, there are employees now that are employed by the DNI, but they don't have any collection assets. The stuff that they're analyzing and writing about is stuff collected by all the other intelligence organizations. So I see utility on one hand for a DNI, but on the other, the way that it was formed and shaped was less of a CEO and more of a takeover that had nothing to offer.
Well, and you had the experience with the Office of Special Plans. Was that what it was called?
Yes.
That the White House would decide to create or the Pentagon.
That's the Pentagon.
The Pentagon would create its own intelligence analysts, analytical service. There are, as we found out talking about early on in the Trump administration, 17, 18, umpteen different intelligence agencies. How should a DNI try to coordinate what's done by so many agencies with overlapping interests and perhaps different clientele?
And I think that's a fair question, and there does need to be some kind of collection. It shouldn't be done at the cabinet level, as in cabinet makers should not have to figure out, well, what does the FBI think? Well, what does the CIA think? But there doesn't necessarily have to be a collective voice, and that's what I'm concerned about, is that too often some of these products, like the PDB, gets coordinated among many different agencies, the Presidential Daily Brief. I think it's fine to keep and maintain some products as coming directly from the CIA. It's fine to maintain that the FBI shares, their version of whatever. I see there's a whole overhaul that I would love to write for the DNI, but we don't have time for that this evening.
Fair enough. Good. Let's go, this young man right here. You need a microphone? Right, keep your hand up, please, so she'll see you. Yeah, there you go.
How much does the CIA control what is and isn't classified? And how much do you feel like classification gets in the way of public debate?
I mean, they control what they own and collect. Anything that's collected under the auspices of CIA and analyzed there by their analysts. I do think there's a government-wide problem with overclassification. I think that's been acknowledged by almost everybody at this point. You just send an email that says, "Hi, do you want to go to lunch?" It's usually secret. So even if neither one of you are undercover, it's just a default. So it's easier to do that than get in trouble for not classifying something properly. There does need to be an absolute overhaul about how things get classified and declassified.
And who would make that decision, right? So where would that kind of push have to come from?
Congress?
Congress, no.
Yeah, right. It's not gonna happen.
All right, let's go over here, please. The microphone's coming to you. It's right behind you. There it is.
Thank you for your talk. It didn't occur to me until right now, but what's central about the CIA? What should its name be?
That's
And what was it?
question I've never had before. I don't, Raleigh?
That's right. We're going back. If the CIA itself was created to be a clearinghouse and was supposed to be the place where it all happened.
Prior to the DNI, the director of Central Intelligence Agency was the head of all of the intelligence organizations. So maybe that's why? I don't know. I'm going to have to yeah, she's nodding.
It is aspirational.
Yes,
that's why, right? That's what it was.
Thank you.
That's what it's supposed to be. And the fact that the agency's 72 years old and we're still having this discussion
My
about what it's
analytic
supposed to
skills,
mean.
they still work.
Very good. Let's go right here. The microphone will come back to you. Please.
You know, some people have described terrorism as a kind of hydra, whereby you cut off the one head of the monster and another tree comes up from that. So as a targeter for Zarqawi, was that ever a concern that taking out Zarqawi would then result in more lesser Zarqawis coming out? And as a targeter, was that one of your concerns? My second question is that in your book where you describe Zarqawi as the godfather of ISIS, and you hear certain quarters saying that ISIS has been defeated, I would just like to hear what's your opinion about that. Do you think that ISIS is truly defeated in this time and age?
So for the first part of the question, I don't view terrorism as like a hydra. I don't think that there's this really strong, eternally living body that will constantly regenerate itself. But I do think extremist ideology, as we know from just looking at neo-Nazis, this has been going on for a very long time. There are people who are always attracted to some kind of extremist message. So I think, in general, extremism has roots and is continually a problem for humanity. I don't think ISIS is gone. They have recaptured some territory. Al-Qaeda is not gone. They're a covert organization. We don't hear from them, and that's purposeful. I do think that this is a, century-old problem. And humanity is still grappling with trying to figure out how do we really impact the growth of extremist ideology, and how do we stem the tide besides just putting in deterrence?
Along those lines, do you think that we do enough, or our agencies, our government, thinking about extremism outside of the specific context of this or that terrorist group? Are there efforts to understand extremism that would, say, include both radical Islamic extremism in one place, but also different extremism domestically, or various other movements? Or do we still think of terrorism as a Middle East thing and neo-Nazism as a someplace else thing? I mean, is this an issue?
While I was working at the agency, there was a whole office within the Counterterrorism Center that was dedicated to just a broader, more strategic focus, projecting 10, 20 years down the road, and looking at it from that more holistic perspective. Obviously, the CIA cannot spy domestically. They're prohibited from doing that. Right. But there's I'm sure there are people that are still continuing that work. I know a couple of my friends who are still there.
All right, we have time for one more question from the audience. Let's go right up here up front. Microphone's coming to you, sir. It's right there.
You know, when you talked about your initial book being redacted to some extent, I'm sort of thinking of a high school French teacher I had who said, today we're going to learn all the parts of the body except those you really want to know. Well, my question would be, in your opinion, was their ultimate redaction sort of dumbing your book down to a 9 or to a 5?
Oh, boy.
Ooh.
Out of 10. Probably down to 8.5.
All right. So is that as a result of the successful lawsuit which pushed
Yes.
back against? So
Yes.
what do you think they wanted to take it down
Otherwise,
to?
it would have been a 4.
All right. Well, I have time for one more question because that was short. So this gentleman right here will be our last question of the night.
Thank you. In the book, you talked about the burden placed on the agency to link al-Qaeda with Iraq. And I was wondering, was anybody exploring links between al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia?
So, yes. And that was handled in a different department that was looking at al-Qaeda writ large. We were focused on any terrorist connections Iraq may have had. And Zarqawi's group started out as a completely independent organization and didn't join al-Qaeda until after the invasion. So while we were evaluating whether or not Iraq had connections with al-Qaeda, there was a whole different other department that was looking at al-Qaeda in general.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you very much, Nada,
Thank
for
you.
sharing your thoughts with us.